My grandmother and her children moved into number 23 Huntley Drive shortly before the outbreak of World War II. My mother grew up in the house, and my parents lived there for a number of years after they married. In 1953, I was born in the front room of the house. I spent all of my childhood playing in the garden, playing in the street, and playing on the fields behind the houses. I have many fond memories of my childhood, and although I no longer have any family living there, Huntley Drive will always hold a special place in my heart and in my memories. So, when a genealogy website I subscribed to provided access to archived copies of the Hull Daily Mail up to and including 1950, I thought it would be both interesting and fun to investigate life on the drive as reported in the newspaper. The following is what I found. The classified ads tell us something about the early days of the drive and the people who bought houses there. In August 1932, a three-bedroomed house was offered for sale for £550, or to let for 21 shillings plus rates. I don't know exactly when construction of houses on the drive began, but I believe it started in the early 1930s. So although the ad doesn't specify as much, I suspect the house might be brand new. £550 in 1932 is the equivalent of £38,645 in 2020. So with the houses currently selling for £120,000 and upwards, we can see that property prices have increased at more than 3 times the rate of inflation. In February 1935, a compact two-bedroomed house was offered for sale at £387 and 10 shillings. The ad states that the house was built the previous year, so we can tell that the drive was developed over a period of several years. Although the houses on the drive were by no means as fancy as those on the nearby avenues, nonetheless they appear to have attracted a relatively prosperous class of people who could afford domestic help. This ad from January 1933 seeks a domestic servant for live-in employment. The occupants of number 23, which was later to become my grandmother's house, were looking for a day girl in August 1938. The position must have been a temporary one because the following month the house was for sale. Note that the house is described as semi-detached, which I suppose is technically correct, but end of terrace would be a more accurate description. I found a total of 362 advertisements in the period studied, and obviously I'm not going to try to reproduce them all here. They are mainly house for sale or let, help wanted, or small sales such as furniture and bicycles. The small sale ads being found mainly during and after the war. Looking at all other types of article, the earliest I've found are birth, marriage and death announcements. In November 1932, Elsie, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Nicholson of Huntley Drive, married Robert Rowe. In March 1933, a daughter was born to Alice and Edwin Booth. I knew the Booths when I was a child. They lived at number 19, but, as can be seen in the announcement, their house was named St. Brelade, if that's the correct pronunciation. I don't know the significance of that. The only St. Brelade I know of is a parish of Jersey in the Channel Islands. Perhaps they had a connection to that place. Their daughter was named Mary. Edwin died in 1973, aged 70, and Alice died in 1980, aged 79. The next image is a little distorted, making it impossible to read the house number, but we can see that the Harrison family welcomed a baby girl into the world in September 1933. Sadly, the Sanderson family from number 77 suffered a tragedy in November 1933 when their daughter was stillborn. At number 5, in December 1933, Robert Stanley Thompson died suddenly, aged just 71, leaving behind his wife, Lillian. A happy event at number 13, when a son was born to Norman and Alice Dunn in May 1934. September 1934, and another occupant of the drive married. This occasion merited a short article in the newspaper, as Miss Catherine Woodhouse of 75 Huntley Drive married Leslie, the son of well-known Hull church and cinema organist Mr. H. F. Fawcett. Cinemas transitioned from silent movies to talkies in the late 20s and early 30s, so Mr. Fawcett was probably soon to be out of a job. But given the popularity of the cinema in those days, before the arrival of television, he was probably still something of a local celebrity, certainly well known enough for the marriage of his son to merit several column inches. Edwin Booth, from number 19, wrote a letter to the Mail in July 1935, complaining about the mail service from Hull to Gothenburg, Sweden. By 1939, I know that Edwin was a housing inspector for Hull Corporation, but this letter seems to indicate that in 1935 he was involved in a different kind of business. Exactly what, I'm not sure. Another happy event in February 1936, when a son was born to the Barkers at number 20. Divorce was rarer back then than it is now, but it did still happen. In July 36, Gladys Hudson was granted a divorce from her husband John on account of his misconduct with a Mrs. Daisy Grayburn. In April 1937, the Mail reported on an accident in Beverley in which a pedestrian was struck by a car. I have not reproduced the entire article, just the part that mentions Thomas Nicholson of Huntley Drive, who seems to have appeared as a character witness. July 1937, and another resident of the Drive gets divorced. This time it's Edna Weldon, whose husband George has been indiscreet with a lady in Leeds. Billy and Nancy Train were my neighbours at number 21 Huntley Drive. As a child, I do vaguely remember being shown a model ship that Mr. Train had made. I can't be sure, but I think it might have been the same one shown in this article from August 1937. Every piece of the ship was handcrafted, and it took him 2 years to complete. I've included on the right the only photograph I have of the trains. I'm not sure of the year, it's probably early 60s, but it was definitely taken in their back garden. He always called his wife Nancy, which is how I now think of her, but in reality her name was Hannah. Billy had spent most of World War I as a prisoner of war. His ability to make things from scraps, the very skills he employed in his model ship making, were, apparently, honed during his years of captivity. Henry Thompson of 15 Huntley Drive died aged 74 in February 1938. Marilyn Judith Mitchell was born on June 15, 1938. Her parents, Gladys and Les, lived at number 37. Another death on the drive in April 1938. 86-year-old Thomas Hornsby of 71 Huntley Drive passed away. John Edwin Dixon, a hairdresser living on Huntley Drive, was in bankruptcy court in June 1938. He had overextended himself, opening hairdressing businesses on Leonard Street, Newland Ave, and Champlan's Ave. Cut-price competition in the ladies' hairdressing business affected his revenues and left him insolvent to the tune of £25. In today's terms, that's only around £1,700. And although that's not a trivial amount, it also doesn't seem like much in the context of a business. But I suppose such things were viewed differently back then. Percival and Grace Williamson, at number 18, celebrated 25 years of marriage in July 1939. In September 1939, the United Kingdom declared war on Nazi Germany. Thus began the 8-month period known as the Phony War. Little actual fighting occurred in that period, giving the country time to prepare for war. Air raid shelters were hurriedly installed in anticipation of what was to come. The shelter at my grandmother's house remained in place until 2007. In this 1951 photograph of my mother, you can see some of the shelter behind her left shoulder. Around this time, the government compiled a record of everyone living in the British Isles. The collection, known as the 1939 Register, is available for inspection via the same genealogy website I used to access the newspaper archives. I'll provide more information at the end of this video. The next Huntley Drive related article to appear in the newspaper is quite long, so I have not transcribed it. It describes a situation brought about by the closing of schools due to the state of war. I'm fairly certain schools were not closed for the entire duration of the war, so this was presumably just an initial reaction by the authorities, possibly done while schools scrambled to build air raid shelters big enough to hold all their pupils in the event of a daytime raid. Whatever the cause, it left many housewives with restless children to entertain, so a group of mothers organised an emergency school that became known as the Huntley Drive Academy for Young Ladies and Gentlemen. While the girls were busy with needlework projects, the boys were on the field, setting up a ring for a boxing tournament. The next article describes the boxing tournament. The boys, all aged around 10 years old, bashed each other about to raise money for the war effort. They collected the grand sum of 17 shillings. Competing in the tournament were Two-Ton Thompson, Whirlwind Woodall, Boxing Billy, Kid Oliver, Tubby Johnson, Coshing Coleman, Battling Bull, and Ernest Parkinson, who presumably couldn't think of a catchy nickname. Since September 1939, there had been a handful of air raid alerts, but so far the city had not been attacked. That all changed at 11 p.m. on June the 19th, 1940. Raiders dropped incendiaries and high explosive bombs on East Hull. Victor Street and Buckingham Street took the brunt of the attack, but little damage was done. The Daily Mail reported 2 bombers shot down and noted that the Nazis claimed to have set ablaze oil storage tanks at Salt End. They hadn't. But a fortnight later, on July the 1st, in what was the first daytime raid over England, a lone plane attacked Salt End and succeeded in destroying the oil tanks. The intensity of attacks increased in 1941 and started to strike closer to Huntley Drive. On the night of February the 4th, 1941, Goddard Avenue was hit, causing a huge crater in the road. It is not surprising then that the blackout requirements were strictly enforced, and we find both Alan Campbell from number 9 and Leslie Gibson from number 11A in court in the early months of the year for failure in that respect. Campbell was fined 30 shillings, the equivalent to around £75 in today's terms. Gibson got away with a fine of 1 guinea, or 21 shillings. Raids intensified throughout March, and in that period Huntley Drive had a very near miss. A cluster of bombs, probably all from the same plane, hit the wool sheds and National Avenue. 2 other bombs struck even closer to home. One landed in Chantellans Avenue next to the railway bridge, where the petrol station stands today. The other dropped immediately behind number 37 in the corner of the field now known as Bakersfield. My grandmother told me about this bomb. She had gotten her children, including my mother, into the air raid shelter, but had then dashed back into the house to get something else, probably her purse. As she returned to the shelter, the bomb exploded and the blast blew her back into the house. She was uninjured, but windows were broken and soot came down the chimney and ruined the living room. She swore there and then that Hitler must die, and sure enough, 4 years later, he did, thus proving it didn't pay to mess with my grandmother. In other raids, incendiary bombs caused fires in Murrayfield Road, but this was the closest Huntley Drive came to disaster. Incidentally, the explosion that created the bomb crater that became the playground for a couple of generations of post-war kids occurred a year later on the night of May the 19th, 1942. The bomb crater, or Bommy as we called it, was there until the development of the golf centre in the early 1970s. By the end of the war, Hull had experienced 815 air raid alerts, resulting in 1,000 hours under alerts. 1,200 people died and another 3,000 were injured. These figures are surprisingly light considering that 86,715 houses were damaged in one way or another. That's over 93% of all the houses in the city damaged. 152,000 people were made homeless. Yet, despite the constant raids and threats of death and destruction, normal life continued in 1941. James Milner, at number 1 Huntley, was the honorary secretary of the Newland Youth Recreation Club. He was busy organising cricket practice and matches for boys aged 14 to 18. Mary, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Sheridan, at number 61, married Stuart Dodds on June 23, 1941, at St. Vincent's Church on Queen's Road. And, predictably, people were still falling foul of the Black Outlaws. This time it was Clifford Hughes of number 59 who was fined 21 shillings. In November 1941, William Jack Gibson of 11A Huntley Drive was reported as lost at sea while serving in the Merchant Navy. He left behind his wife Hilda and 3 children, including his son Leslie, who was also serving at sea in the Merchant Navy. 65-year-old John Robert Gardam of 16 Huntley Drive died in May of 42. Neighbourhood children were still raising money for the war effort. This time, children from Huntley Drive and Murrayfield Road, including Elva Barker from number 20 and Eric Randerson from 89, raised £3, 3 shillings and 6 pence. That's around £160 in today's terms. Quite a respectable amount. Robert Knowles, at number 55, is mentioned in his capacity as the Honorary Secretary of the East Riding County Football Association War Emergency League. I thought it interesting to note the kind of problems he faced in this capacity, as indicated in the last paragraph, which reads, "Owing to service calls, Smith & Nephew's AFC have been compelled to withdraw from the league. Young men were being drafted into the armed forces, causing a shortage of players." The next article involves Robert Samuel Knowles, the man we have just seen in reference to a football league. But this time he's in the news for a very different reason. In the course of an alcohol-fueled dispute with his son and daughter-in-law, he pulled out a revolver, and in the ensuing struggle, his son was wounded in the leg and hand. This story surprised me, mainly because I'd never heard about it before. Even though it occurred a decade before my birth, the Knowles family still lived at number 55 when I was a child. Robert William Knowles and his wife Gertrude, the couple referred to in the story, were the parents of one of my best friends, Ricky. I would have thought that something as exciting and scandalous as a shooting on the drive would have become something of a local legend. In a street where gossip travelled quickly, I would have thought at the very least Ricky would have learned of it and told me, but I never heard a word about it. The article finishes by saying, "Judgment was postponed for 6 months, but I can find nothing in the papers to indicate that a judgment was ever made." On a more mundane note, Agnes Campbell of 9 Huntley Drive was fined 15 shillings for ignoring a traffic light while cycling. That's equivalent to about £38 today. Luck was not with the Campbell family in 1943, because in October, at the age of just 35, her husband, Alan, died in the Hull Royal Infirmary, leaving behind Agnes and their young son, Duncan. My grandmother's house became a second home for Duncan, so that Agnes could continue to work without having to leave the young lad at home alone in such dangerous times. The next 2 articles concern Hezekiah Hotham and actions that led to him being awarded the George Medal. The articles are quite long. Depending on the size of the screen with which you are watching, you might be able to pause the video and read them if you're interested. Otherwise, you can just listen to my summary. Hezekiah was the brother of Olive Riley and stayed with Olive and Arthur Riley at number 35 Huntley Drive when he was not at sea. He served in the Merchant Navy and was second engineer on a ship carrying munitions to a North African port, where they were caught in an air attack that set the ship on fire. While others effected the rescue of several badly injured seamen, Hezekiah stayed below, keeping the pumps going. He only abandoned his post at the last possible moment. For his gallantry, he was awarded the George Medal. In the family announcements section, the family of Ada Ramsdale expressed appreciation for the expressions of sympathy they received on the death of their mother in January 1944. I assume Ada was the mother-in-law of Robert William Knowles, whose wife's maiden name was Ramsdale. Albert Woodhouse, at number 75, died suddenly at the age of 74 on June 3, 1944. Robert Samuel Knowles, whose gun crime we read about in 1943, died aged 46 in March 1945. Ernest Charles Conyers died in May 1945. It appears he did not live in Huntley Drive, but the funeral cortege started at his daughter's house at number 65. Following 4 funerals, the next event is a wedding. After 4 years in Burma, Sergeant Kenneth Robert Mallon, the youngest son of Mr. and Mrs. Duffield of 73 Huntley Drive, is home and is getting married. A report in the newspaper in May 1945 tells of the wounding of Lieutenant R.R.C. Philpott, the husband of Doris Philpott of number 53 Huntley Drive. Reginald Philpott was a career army officer, having been in the army for 14 years. He went to Normandy soon after D-Day and had been in Northern Europe ever since. The article does not detail the severity of his wound, nor does it indicate when he'll be coming home. However, we can assume he came home soon after this and was not too badly wounded because, 10 months later, the newspaper announced the birth of a son to Reg and Doris. The Savage family lived next door but one to the Philpotts, and the patriarch of that family was in the paper in June 1945. As a captain in the Royal Naval Reserve, serving in the Pacific Theatre, he was instrumental in finding the civil authorities of the region of Akyat in Burma, who were hiding from the Japanese on a remote island. The mayor of Akyat then gave him a letter to convey to the Allied forces, requesting their help in restoring civil law throughout the region. In Kenya in 1945, Captain Eric Hotham, attached to the King's African Rifles, married Mary Keyes from Gillingham in Kent. Eric was the only son of Arthur and Olive Riley at number 35 Huntley. You may recall from the previous reports of the heroism of Hezekiah Hotham, Olive's brother, that Hotham was Olive's maiden name. Also in October of 45, my grandmother, Cecilia Holden, announced the forthcoming marriage of her eldest daughter, my aunt, Joyce Holden, to William Hatfield. Joyce was serving in the Women's Land Army throughout the war, and William was in the RAF. I note that the Hatfield family were from Market Wheaton. My grandmother's family also came from Market Wheaton, so I wonder if that's how the connection between Joyce and William occurred. The photograph is from my personal collection, not from the newspaper. In March 1946, the funeral cortege of Alice Crowder left the home of her son, Wilfred, at number 17. In 1940, Wilfred Pepper of 69 Huntley Drive was working as a casual labourer for Newsom & Walker Limited, a building contractor. While digging, his spade apparently hit a rock, injuring his back, an injury that eventually led to surgery for a fractured 7th cervical vertebrae. Since that time, Wilfred claims to have been in constant pain, making him unfit for and unable to work. An arbitration court found in his favour and awarded him compensation to be paid by Newsom & Walker Limited. By 1947 he was receiving £2.15 per week. His former employers suspected him of fraud and had taken him to court on at least the 2 occasions shown here, one in 1944 and another in 1947. Naturally, they were looking to prove that he was fit for some kind of work, even if it was only light work, and thus get rid of their obligation to pay his weekly compensation. On the first occasion, they argued that a man who could go out for a drink or play bridge was fit enough for light work, but the court found in Pepper's favour on the advice of a panel of medical experts. On the second occasion, the company had hired a private detective to follow Pepper. He was observed working as a bookmaker at the Hull dog track, and this, they argued, was proof that there was work he could manage. The article does not reveal how the case ended, and I have been unable to find any further information about it. As we reach the end of the period covered by the archives, we're left with notices of another 2 deaths on the drive. On Christmas Day 1947, Ron and Doreen Thackeray lost their 3-week-old baby daughter Pamela. Doreen was the sister of Robert William Knowles, who we met earlier. The grandmother mentioned in the notice is Martha Knowles, widow of the late Robert Samuel Knowles. At number 7, 73-year-old Harry Jokowicz died in January 1948. The very last Huntley Drive related article, other than miscellaneous for sale notices, is a plea from Irene Rowe at number 31 for the return of a gold bracelet lost on a trip to the new theatre. Earlier in the video, I promised to provide more information about the 1939 register of the civilian population of England and Wales. The register was designed to capture the details of every member of the civilian population as of the 29th of September 1939. It was used to produce identity cards and ration books, and was also used to administer conscription. 2 online genealogy services, findmypast.co.uk and ancestry.com, provide access to the register, but both require a subscription. To view the records online, free of charge, you would need to visit the National Archives Reading Room in Kew. The register indicates there are 69 houses on the drive, yet it only lists 67 properties. For reasons unknown to me, number 40 and number 41 are not listed. The records of people born more than 100 years ago are always available to view, but for others, records are locked unless proof of their death has been confirmed. Of the 171 occupants of the drive, 22 records remain locked. The oldest inhabitant was William Knowles at number 37, born on February the 13th, 1868. He was 71 years old at the time. The oldest woman was Edith Woodhouse, born on March the 8th, 1870. She was 69 years old at the time. If you're still with me at this point, you obviously have an interest in Huntley Drive and its history. You will therefore be pleased to know that I shall be creating a follow-up video in which I'll look in detail at the households recorded in the 1939 register and add my recollections of the people who lived there in the 50s and 60s. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it.